I understand that we can now listen to the General Director of Gaza Hospitals, who's speaking live. Let's listen in.
Cross will be taking care of those inside the hospital. As we speak, the Red Cross or the World Health Organization representatives, none of them has confirmed that the remaining patients and victims who were stranded and left behind in al-Shifa hospitals have been safely evacuated. As I told you, many of them are amputees, others are critically wounded, and the rest were surgically operated on and they were not able to move. In addition to the premature newborn babies who were left inside the hospitals. We were forced to leave at gunpoint. We were not able to do anything to those stranded. We were not able even to cater to those babies in the incubators. The situation is really more than dire. All those patients and victims who were left behind are totally unable to move. Many amputees, disabled and critically wounded. Those are supposed to be transported in ambulances. However, the Israeli occupation forces soldiers denied them this. The Israeli occupation forces claim that it is you who requested evacuation, not them. I categorically deny all these false allegations. We were given a one-hour ultimatum by the Israeli occupation forces. We have been besieged for weeks. Columns of tanks around the hospital for weeks. Electric power is out for weeks. The water connection is out for a week. We were left to die slowly inside the hospital. Even the pharmacy and the medical supply stock storage were destroyed. How can we do anything? We were left helpless before our patients and victims. And this morning, it was the Israeli occupation forces that gave us 1 hour ultimatum. Amid all these difficult situations, the medical staff was functioning and operating. Even if one of the patients requested to be evacuated, which I assure you did not happen, I assure you that all the communications that took place that prove that all the patients and victims refused to leave. I'm telling you, we were forced to leave at gunpoint. However, some of our fellow doctors remained there with the remaining patients and wounded inside the hospital. Therefore, the Israeli occupation forces must be held liable for these crimes. I assure you, dozens, if not hundreds, of those patients recently evacuated and currently walking on the road will lose their life as a result. You mentioned that you did all what you can in order to have the newborn babies evacuated into Egypt. Where do you think these efforts have come to? We have provided a list of the medical staff, the nurses, and also a list of the names of newborn babies who are required to be swiftly transported into Egypt. We provided all the necessary documents to the Red Cross. However, as we speak, nothing has happened. We also communicated with the Red Cross that we are prepared to transport those newborn babies in ambulances up to Rafah crossing into Egypt. This is not a mission impossible. Yet the Israeli occupation forces turned a blind eye to our requests. I was even told that the UN representative was humiliated by the Israeli soldiers. The Red Cross driver was forced to leave the UN vehicle. Even the UN staff are not protected. They are being harassed, assaulted, and humiliated by the Israeli forces. This also yet another crime committed by the Israeli occupation forces. At least all what we hope that those newborn babies are transported to the south, where they can at least be put into incubators to save their lives. We are joined by journalist Jihad Abu Shanab within the vicinity of al-Shifa hospital. Journalist Jihad Abu Shanab, can you tell us what have you heard from the eyewitnesses you spoke to? We spoke to some of those who were stranded inside al-Shifa hospital. They gave us heart-wrenching stories by all sense of the word. Total disaster. Many dozens of wounded and victims, and also patients were left behind. Those with minor and medium injuries were forced to leave. On the way, they were assaulted and humiliated as they were forced to leave at gunpoint by the Israeli occupation forces. Those who were able to walk managed to leave, and those who were not were put on wheelchairs. We spoke also to some of the civilians who were kept hostage inside the hospital. They described the situation inside the hospital as nothing but disaster. Total absence of electric power, total absence of water connection, total absence of hygiene and cleanliness. In addition to that, and what the Israeli forces have entered the hospital and forced them to leave at gunpoint. Many of those who left the hospital were not even able to walk. They were guided by the Israeli soldiers through al-Wahda road, heading to the south. Some of the civilians, including myself, were forced to head towards the Baptist hospital. All what we saw on the road is nothing but destruction, total destruction. The whole vicinity of the Baptist hospital and residential area were leveled to the ground. Dozens of Palestinians are lying dead. Dozens of bodies are left. They are even beyond recognition. They cannot be recognized. Many of those dead bodies are bloated and reeking. We are trying to do all what we can to bury what or who we can. The whole area around the Baptist hospital is leveled to the ground. You name it. The Arab Bank building, the whole area. And till the early hours of the morning, the Israeli warplanes continued to pound the eastern side of Gaza city ruthlessly, relentlessly, and indiscriminately. This proves that the eyewitness accounts we have heard from those inside the hospital and were forced to leave at gunpoint prove that many are still stranded inside the hospital. In the morning, in the early hours of the morning, the Israeli occupation forces contacted the management of the hospital and gave them a 1-hour ultimatum. At the beginning, they instructed them to leave through Salahuddin Road to the west, and later on, they came back to say that they are supposed to leave to the east through al-Wahda Road. We were also learned that many of the medical staff was interrogated and held by the Israeli soldiers. Needless to say that the medical staff has been working day and night around the clock, exhausted beyond description. We carried whoever we can from among the patients and victims with us, and those who could walk. We speak about 4 days of total siege. The Israeli tanks surrounded the hospital and shelling the area without discrimination. To be specific, we do not know exactly what is happening behind us. We were told that some doctors and medical staff were kept hostage by the Israeli soldiers. Even some civilians were kept inside the hospital. We do not know what is happening to them and what would become of them. As I said, we carried all what we can. We are now trying to reach the nearest hospital or medical facility in order to have those wounded attended to. Needless to say that many of the hospitals and medical facilities in the north are already out of service for weeks. Where do you think those who were evacuated from the hospital head to? As I said, the Israeli occupation forces instructed those leaving the hospital to leave through Salah ad-Din Road. However, we received accounts from eyewitnesses that the Israeli soldiers are deployed along Salah ad-Din Road. This is the road separating the north part of Gaza Strip from the south. The Israeli occupation forces set up a checkpoint where men are denied access to the south while women are allowed to leave. With respect to those who left the hospital, they were forced to leave through Salah ad-Din Road into the south.
هل تعرضوا لأي مضايقات من تم إخلاءهم قسريا من داخل مجمع الشفاء؟
How did you, what treatment did you receive, and were you harassed or assaulted on your way out? The eyewitnesses we spoke to, they said they have been subjected to strict questioning and interrogation for hours and hours as the Israeli soldiers interrogated them. In addition to that, many were body searched in a humiliating fashion. Many women were forced to unclothe, to take off their clothes and be subjected to body search. These were very humiliating incidents. Many of the civilians inside the hospital even were kept hostages in the upper floor of the hospital, denied food, water, and treated with humiliation and abuse. In addition to that, all those who left the hospitals cannot find any means of transportation. They are forced to leave on foot. We heard many accounts from eyewitnesses that some patients and victims are left behind inside the hospital and were promised to be evacuated by the international organizations, including the Red Cross. There is no doubt that those who left the hospital are overwhelmed by fear and also by anger, simply because the UN and Red Cross representative cannot have access into the hospital. The Israeli occupation forces have denied access to all the area, including the UN representatives and the Red Cross officials. We do not know what would become of those who remained stranded inside the hospital. All what we can say is that they are left in a very grave situation. Needless to say that those patients and victims left behind are in very critical conditions. They cannot be moved haphazardly or randomly. Their lives are endangered. They need to be moved and transported with special care, and we do not know if anyone is moved in a wrong way, he will immediately lose his life. And as we speak, we do not know what would become of them. Even the patients themselves and those who left do not know what would become of those left behind. How about the premature newborn babies? As I said, all those who left the hospital confirm that they do not know what would become of those left behind, including the premature newborn babies. Again, they confirmed that the patients and victims left behind are in very critical conditions. They cannot be moved randomly. They require special care, special attention, and specific protocols must be followed in order to spare the lives of those patients. Needless to say, many of them are still on medications and put on appliances. Their lives are hanging by a thread. Those left behind are really in grave danger. The anesthetic specialist informed us that the evacuation was disastrous. In addition to that, the medical crew were humiliated. One of the doctors told me that this is unprecedented in the history of modern life. He also said that he lived through many wars inside Gaza and other regional wars. It was the first time throughout his professional career to see medical staff treated in this inhumane way. Total humiliation. The Israeli occupation forces and soldiers were abusing the medical staff verbally and physically. He informed them that he is a professional doctor, but he was still being abused by the Israeli soldiers, and he was humiliated and forced to leave at gunpoint. This is expected from the Israeli occupation forces and their soldiers. They are acting in inhumane, unethical fashion. We pray that the world community, the Red Cross, and the International World Health Organization would act to spare the lives of those left behind, especially the newborn babies. Can you give us an estimate figure of those who left the hospital? You said you were in the vicinity of the hospital and you spoke to many eyewitnesses, those who left, women and children. Can you give us an estimate figure? We spoke to many. They were in dozens. We do not know that this was the first or second wave of those who left the hospital, but many of them were wounded. Others were already patients walking on crutches. Many of them also were walking on one leg as they lost one of their limbs. Many of them were on wheelchairs, others on beds. Those inside the hospital were not evacuated in one lot. They were evacuated in groups, yet they were forced at gunpoint and they were forced to leave in a single file. They confirmed that the Israeli soldiers humiliated them and assaulted them throughout the process. They described the situation as a genocide war. In addition to the physical danger they've been through, they have been subjected to very severe moral and mental stress. Despite all that, all the doctors in the hospital assured them and confirmed that they will stand by them till the last moment, until the last. And this is what they did. This is very courageous and very brave from the medical staff. They have spared no effort to cater to the victims and patients till the last moment. The medical staff requested the Israeli forces at least to sequester those critically wounded, but they refused. They acted in a very harsh fashion, assaulting all inside the hospital, humiliating them, abusing them physically and verbally. No discrimination. Medical staff, nurses, victims, patients, civilians, families, all inside the hospitals were subjected to humiliation and abuse. In addition to that, dozens of dead bodies are still lying on the ground inside the hospital compound. All the eyewitnesses I spoke to, they were inside the hospital. They were side by side with the medical staff. They confirmed that the medical staff confirmed to the Israeli occupation forces that they were not leaving without the patients and victims. Doctors and nurses refused to leave. They made it clear to the Israeli soldiers they were not going to leave without their patients and victims. And all eyewitnesses we spoke to spoke volumes about the bravery of the medical staff. They stood to the Israeli soldiers and made it clear that they will not going to leave without the patients and victims leaving first. The medical staff and the doctors confirmed that they cannot be dictated orders from an occupation force. They must be only communicated by the Red Cross and international health executives, to the degree that many of the medical staff were forced to leave at gunpoint. In addition to that, many of them were kept behind for interrogation, and we do not know what would become of them.
جهاد أبو شنب الصحفي من محيط مجمع الشفاء الطبي، ابقى معنا. نتحول الآن إلى السيد إسماعيل الثوابتة المدير العام.
We are joined by Ismail Thawabta, the Director General of the Media Bureau of Gaza Strip. You are following on the screens the forcible evacuation of patients, victims, families, and medical crew from inside the Shifa hospital. How do you comment? What happened is yet another war crime added to the many war crimes committed by the Israeli occupation forces. The Israeli occupation forces laid tight siege for 15 days by tanks, snipers, artillery around the hospital for weeks, where every moving object was a lawful target to them. Today, they were given a 1-hour ultimatum, after which the Israeli soldiers stormed the hospital, accompanied by the bulldozers. The soldiers, armed to the teeth with sniffing dogs, they all stormed the hospital. This hospital is supposed to be protected under the international law and Geneva Conventions. Each and every corner of the hospital was occupied by the Israeli soldiers and we warn the world that the Israeli occupation forces are now going to propagate false allegations. The Israeli soldiers came inside the hospital. Before they came in, they shelled large portions of the buildings. Many of the ambulances were also destroyed. All those inside the hospital were put to strict body search. After that, the Israeli soldiers started to damage the medical appliances inside the hospital. In addition to that, they destroyed the medical supplies storage, and this is another war crime committed by the Israelis. This is a medical facility. Adding to all these crimes, they gave a 1-hour ultimatum this morning to the medical staff. Forcible evacuation of patients and wounded is a crystal clear war crime. The Israeli occupation forces yesterday exhumed the graves we made inside the hospital yard. They took away more than 100 dead bodies who were already buried. In addition to that, all those victims who recently died were denied burial as the Israeli occupation forces refused to have them buried inside the hospital. As I said, days ago, as dead bodies were piling up inside the hospital, the hospital management were forced to dig a mass grave and bury all the dead. This morning, the Israeli bulldozers undug those graves and took away the dead bodies. In addition to that, the medical staff were subjected to body search and interrogated. They were also forced to take off their clothes. The Israeli occupation forces, together with the international community, are responsible and liable for these crimes. And as we speak, the Israeli soldiers are inside the hospital. It is now turned into a prison, detention camp, and a mass grave. How do you comment that the Israelis gave them only a 1-hour ultimatum? I believe the Israeli occupation forces are trying to propagate that they have made a military achievement. Yet, this is nothing but a cowardly act. This is a civilian medical facility. There is no military manifestation. The Israeli forces cordoned the area for days and started to use speakers calling for those inside to evacuate. Until the last minute, the medical crew refused to leave without the patients and victims being safely transported to the nearest hospital. As I said, the Israeli occupation forces wish to turn this hospital into a military barrack. They wish to depict to the whole world that they made a military achievement. I also believe they are going to fabricate staged evidence to provide excuse to their actions, to these crimes. And I regret to say that they are acting with impunity. The Israeli soldiers are armed to the teeth, accompanied by canine units. Before that, the drones hovering over the hospital for days killed dozens of the civilians and those within the vicinity of the hospital. Before that, the electric power was cut off for weeks. In addition to that, the water supply, the main water supply also was cut off. We have been warning the whole world that the Shifa hospital is housing 39 newborn babies, in addition to dozens of patients who are living on respiratory oxygen appliances. And these apparatuses require electric power. The Israeli occupation forces purposefully cut off the power and water, despite the fact that they know for sure that those patients and victims their lives are hanging by a thread. And what adds insult to injury is that the Israeli occupation forces also denied food and water to all those inside the hospital. As a result, 150 from among the civilians inside the hospital died over the week. This is also another war crime. In addition to that, the food supplies storage or the pharmacy of the hospital was also destroyed. The Israeli occupation forces are aware that those victims require immediate medical attention from home surgical operation theaters, oxygen generators, and despite all that, the Israelis denied them by cutting off the power. This is a deliberate act of murder. When they stormed the hospital, they subjected many of the medical staff and innocent civilians, were body searched, humiliated, were forced at gunpoint to take off their clothes, and they were subjected to interrogation for hours. Many of them are still held back. Many of them were also tortured by the Israeli soldiers. And after all these crimes, the Israeli occupation forces at gunpoint forced all those inside the hospital to leave. The wounded and the patients who are already suffering, physically suffering, have carried their wounds and pain and started to walk on foot for kilometers and kilometers. The Israeli occupation forces for sure is aware that those innocent civilians, the wounded, the victims, the patients are going to die simply for the reason that they require swift medical attention. Many of them require immediate surgical procedures. They were forced to leave at gunpoint with absolutely inhumane, humiliating methods. Again, this is another war crime. We believe many of those victims and patients will not make it. Many of them will die on the road. As we speak, all Gaza streets are scattered with dead bodies, bloated and reeking all over the place.
تأتينا من جباليا شمال مدينة غزة لقصف إسرائيلي متواصل عليها. إذا نحن نشاهد دخان يتصاعد في سماء غزة بعد هذا القصف الإسرائيلي على جباليا شمال مدينة غزة. أعود إليك سيد إسماعيل ثوابت مرة جديدة. سيد إسماعيل، كيف تجري عملية الاستعداد لاستقبال المرضى والجرحى الذين
How do you think those evacuated from the hospital will be received and where, especially that other few hospitals are already suffering sharp shortage of supplies, even water and food, let alone the relentless shelling? To begin with, all the remaining hospitals in the south and middle of Gaza Strip are overwhelmingly overpacked with patients and victims, to the degree that large number of them cannot even find a bed or chair. All those patients and victims are lying on the floor, in the corridor. They cannot find the least healthy conditions. And with the influx of those new numbers of patients and victims, no doubt they will be welcomed by their fellow Gazans and no efforts will be spared. However, I assure you, the resources are short, very scant. Even the medical staff compared to the huge number of victims and patients is negligible. We are speaking of thousands and thousands of victims, wounded, and patients who are flocking onto hospitals. I believe this is going to be more disastrous. I assure you, no efforts will be spared. Whatever is possible will be done, but we are helpless. Despite the fact that many of those who are coming out of the Shifa hospitals are with very critical conditions, and we believe many of them will die on the road. We believe they will not be able to make it to the nearest hospital. They are already suffering and in deep pain.
بقي بعض الجرحى من ذوي الحالات الصعبة داخل مستشفى
We know that some critically wounded victims and patients with critical conditions are left inside the hospital. What is the latest about the communication taking place with the UN representative? I stress again that this is the least the Israeli occupation forces would care about. Patients, victims, babies, they do not care. They do not care least about them. They have already committed hundreds of war crimes. However, now they are trying to depict a picture, false picture, that they are acting in a humane way. We do not have any information about those who were left inside al-Shifa hospital, including the newborn babies. But I assure you, they are in very critical conditions. And I assure you, those with severe wounds and those with critical conditions are facing imminent death. In addition to that, the conditions in which those victims and patients would be transported are very complicated. They require certain protocols and they require strict method of transportation. I assure you, those victims and patients are lying in grave danger. That's why we hold the Israeli occupation forces liable for all these crimes.
So you've been listening to a number of voices who have been inside Gaza's largest hospital, al-Shifa, in the north of Gaza, and who've been telling us what's been happening there this morning. So I will try to recap everything that we've just learned. We learned a lot of details on al-Shifa. We heard from Dr. Munir al-Barsh, who's the Director General of the Ministry of Health in Gaza. We heard from the General Director of Gaza Hospitals. We heard from the Head of Orthopedics Department of al-Shifa. We just heard from a government media officer, and we also heard earlier from a journalist who was near the hospital. I say this because we are about to try and paint the most accurate picture that we can of what's happening, and this is based on the 5 or 6 different sources who've been speaking to Al Jazeera.